Today we're here for this event on climate change. I'm not going to give much of an introduction, partly because we're a little behind schedule and people have to go other places, partly because Cornelia, our Vice President, is going to be giving opening remarks that will be talking about the event. So we'll start with those opening remarks. Our colleague Wede from WFP hasn't arrived yet. He'll join us when he comes. This is largely going to be about Rome-based collaboration, but also we have our guests from Sweden who will be talking about some of their perspectives. So why don't we go ahead and start with our Vice President, Cornelia Richter, who joined us a number of months ago now from the German government, from GTZ, or GIZ, one of the Zs, and she'll give us some opening remarks. Thanks.
Really acknowledge that you've decided for this event, because we're aware that in Rome there are always a lot of competitive offers to go to, and we would like to take advantage this afternoon of your presence, also deliberating a little bit on climate challenges. So it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you here to this very short but hopefully very intensive event. I think looking into all your faces, I'm pretty much aware the topic of climate change is not a new one to you, and all of us have very ample evidence that climate change is a multi-pronged threat to food security, to the livelihoods of rural people, and also to all our efforts to eradicate poverty and hunger. The impacts, we've seen it the last years, have led to increased migration, greater food insecurity, and conflict over scarce resources. FAO estimates that the agricultural sector absorbs 25% of the losses due to climate-related disasters. But agriculture is also often seen as a culprit in climate change. This is because the sector accounts for about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, and without expanded measures to reduce greenhouse gas production, emissions growth is expected to persist due to growth in global population and economic activities. Agriculture is also estimated to be the driver for about 80% of global deforestation. On the other hand, agricultural and rural development can be a positive factor in addressing climate change. GHG emissions can be greatly offset through cropland management, better land management, including of grazing lands, and restoration of organic soils. Forestry can act as a considerable carbon sink. These potential benefits are huge. It has been estimated that if we increase the carbon content in agricultural soils by even as little as 0.4% per year, we can halt the annual global increase in CO2. Fortunately, there are signs of growing awareness. There are growing awareness of centrality of agriculture to climate change, both in terms of the threat posed to our food systems and the sector's potential for adaptation and mitigation. At the COP23 in Bonn, negotiators agreed to address agricultural issues for the first time. However, there is still a long way to go. While estimates vary between $410 million to over $410 billion to over $700 billion annually in both private and public climate finance, adaptation remains largely financed by the public sector and is only about 25% of public climate finance. The share devoted to adaptation in agriculture is only 22 billion, and I think this is really an alarming figure. To put that in perspective, it is estimated that Africa alone will be facing adaptation costs of 7 billion to 15 billion by 2020. It has been estimated that crop yields could decrease by 10 to 25% by 2050. And at the same time, some experts predict that climate change is likely to displace 150 million to 200 million people. In the face of such challenges, clearly we need to work together. When I say we, I mean all the donor community, but also the national governments, the private sector, and also civil society. We are supporting, as IFAD, our member states to ensure their food security and to increase the resilience of some of the poorest people in the world, smallholder farmers and other rural people, men and women. In Kenya, for example, the Rome-based agencies are working together with the government, the European Union, and the private commercial bank Equity Bank. The project addresses the interrelated challenges of food insecurity, climate change impacts, and bridging the divide between humanitarian development and commercial initiatives. Launched in 2016, this integrated program aims to raise production and incomes for smallholders in arid and semi-arid zones, stabilize degraded landscapes, and help people formerly dependent on unconditional food aid to become resilient. As an international financing organization, IFAD is especially concerned with addressing the investment gap. IFAD started the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture program, in brief ASAP, in 2012. So far, it has invested over $300 million in building the resilience of smallholder farmers and other rural people, and IFAD will continue its support to countries by dedicating 25% of its finance to climate change. This is a major strategic shift in our policy and also underlines the strong commitment of IFAD to climate change. IFAD also facilitates to funding from the Global Environmental Facility for 40 countries. We are leading the implementation of a GEF-financed integrated approach program for food security with 12 African countries to bring 10 million hectares of land under sustainable management and avoid 10 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The project also aims to increase genetic diversity by 15%. Adaptation in agriculture is key to achieving the 2030 agenda and ensuring food and nutrition security. And I think we should all be aware that although there is a growing awareness for this topic, I think there is still a lacking sense of urgency with regard to particular investments in the agricultural sector, and I hope that we'll find more partners and allies in fighting for these particular issues at international and also national level. I hope we are coming a step further in the next years to come. Now I'm looking forward to an inspiring discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kari. So the way we're going to proceed is that this will be Davos style where we'll ask questions. I'm going to start with a question for each of the panel members, and then we'll go to the audience. So think of your questions while we're having this first discussion. So I'll start with introduction. So to my left is Johannes Aldialund. Close enough, good. Director General for Development Cooperation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sweden. He previously served at the embassies in Tallinn and Pretoria, among others. He is a member of the 5th Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund Advisory Group as of March 2018. So the first question to you. So Sweden's been very generous in its funding, both to IFAD and to others, on investment in climate change with regard to smallholders. So what would you like to see from this kind of investment?
I think that we... Oh yeah, hold on to one of those. I think that our, there's a global recognition of these challenges, and there's a global momentum for sure. So not everyone signs up to this, but in general we have a strong momentum to find new methods and improve on how we respond to climate change. But in moving from that to implementation, we face a number of very concrete problems. From my perspective, where I deal with development cooperation, all of our development cooperation, multilateral and all our bilateral, and sort of how do you allocate a development budget, and how do you then work with these problems? then we face a number of problems. First, of course, needs are pressing in a big number of areas. I mean, we have climate change is by my government recognized as a primary problem, a very acute need and something that we need to address. But at the same time, of course, there's intensified wars, conflicts, increased hunger, unprecedented numbers of refugees. Everyone's talking about the crisis in education. There are a great number of challenges to deal with at the same time. Second, financing. Financing is short. Wherever I go, participate in seminars, meet with fantastic staff of all the international organizations, meet with civil society organizations. You know, everyone comes back, justifiably so, to a shortage of funds to address the problems that they are facing or are tasked to deal with. Agenda 2030 recognizes the need for a massive increase in funding, and also identifies the massive challenges that we have set ourselves to respond to. So there we are in challenge. Third, and this might be more important in this context, climate change and the methods of response are by comparison to some other areas in which we are active, relatively new. Climate change is not new, but the recognition of the problem as a big, real challenge that we have to deal with is still relatively new. So there are still, challenges of design when we come to a deeper level. So what do we do? What do we want to achieve when we allocate our support and when we engage in policy discussion? One, of course, is we want to be part of closing that financial gap. We invest very substantially in prevention and response to climate change. We do that domestically, and we do that, I mean, in my field, in development cooperation. We do it through the perhaps obvious channels, such as the Green Climate Fund, and where we are the biggest donor per capita. We have just set out a new strategy for climate, environment, and oceans, to which we have dedicated, I think, close to $800 million over 4 or 5 years. And we include climate change in almost all of our bilateral strategies. And importantly, in this context, we also try to contribute. I mean, we do contribute, I think, substantially to the Rome-based organizations, and we couple that with prioritizing the issue in our dialogue with the organizations and in driving this in the strategic planning. And a second area, of course, is to do our best to keep the issue up there on the agenda, contribute by advocacy, financing, research, and so on, to keep the climate issue top of the agenda. And third, we do our best in collaboration with organizations such as the Rome-based organizations to develop policy and practicable response. We point at the fact that the diverse areas of challenges that I mentioned at first does not mean that they are not in contradiction. On the contrary, they are interrelated, and our response needs to be interrelated and interlinked. So, and I think, I mean, this is. I realize I'm sort of responding on a bit of a global level, but that's, I think, as a donor government, that's the best way, or donor government in this context. That's the best way that we think that we can contribute. We can, we are clear on the challenges that are here, but we confirm through policy and through contributions that we are starting on the right path, and we engage in the policy discussion to keep us there. But I think that we also have to recognize that we are at the beginning of that path, and that we need, when we work jointly as with all of you, that we need to create systems where there is, clear feedback loops and clear learning, so that we can. You have mentioned, and I'm sure we will hear more examples of good programs, but they are not yet at scale. You have mentioned the underfinancing in the field of agriculture, and I think one reason for that is that we also need to lead by example, show the examples, and show how, and be practical in our, and that's our attempt in our development cooperation, is to contribute to that through financing, through an engaged discussion, and sort of keeping the issue up there. But I also do recognize that we are a donor government. We are not the practical implementers. We need we need this kind of conversation. We need a conversation with you and your partners to find the best ways forward.
Okay, thank you. That leads quite well into the question I was going to ask Margarita. So, Margarita Estralaga, we'll speak with her next. She's the director of IFAD's Environment, Climate, Gender, and Social Inclusion Division. She joined IFAD in 2015 and has more than 2 decades of experience in environment and sustainable development sector, including at both the national level, where she worked in Colombia, and at the international level. So following along the need to learn from experience, what is IFAD learning about dealing with climate change and the challenges of the Agenda 2030 through its portfolio work?
Thanks, Paul, and that's a very interesting question. And first, I would like to say good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here after having been in Stockholm last week, this Swedish event, because in Stockholm we were at the EAT Forum, and I just want to bring back to respond that something that Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the UNF Climate Change Convention Secretariat, stated. She said, on climate issues, I am a stubborn optimist. So, like her, I believe, like Connie said, that governments, civil society, multilaterals, private sector, research institutions, that I think we have a few here, but at the center, smallholders and small-scale fishers will be able to achieve SDG 2. But of course, while we are doing our work, we know that we are also helping to achieve SDG 5 on gender, SDG 13 on climate, and at the same time we have co-benefits for energy, for water, for inclusion, for decent work, for our coastal areas and our oceans, for the land and the biodiversity, and for cooperation. So we are also making sure that through our work in IFAD, and I think in all the multilaterals, we also see clear co-benefits on SDG 6, 7, 8, 10, 14, 15, 17. So we can see that, in fact, Agenda 2030 is the one that is sort of marking the path of what we are doing. And what we have realized in IFAD is that there are some key ingredients that we need. First of all, in our case, is inclusiveness of all vulnerable groups. We have in the rural areas a huge amount, of course, of women that have no access to land, that have no access to finance, that sometimes cannot even find any decent work. We have also a lot of young people that not necessarily are interested in the rural areas. And in many countries, we have very vulnerable indigenous peoples. So for us, inclusiveness of all these groups is key to be able to succeed with the implementation of Agenda 2030. Equity is another aspect that for us is extremely important, including right of future generations. Sometimes we don't think of the ones coming. We are now very worried about the youth, but there is an important element here, because climate, what is climate going to leave to those future generations, to our grandchildren? What is the world that they are going to have? Then innovation, because we need to find different ways of doing business and invent new technologies cheaper and more accessible to the rural communities, as well as partnerships that Connie mentioned are extremely important. And last but not least, the respect for planetary boundaries. Our natural resources, our land, our soil, our water are key to be able to achieve this Agenda 2030. So we have, of course, in IFAD a lot of examples. I'm going to share with you just two, because if not, I will keep you here until midnight, and then we will get to the summer midnight where we have no night. So in the Republic of Uganda, many of you know the ASAP program, the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program. And in Uganda, we have one very interesting program that is prioritizing climate resilience crop production systems. And here, we have invested in multiplication of improved seed varieties that will help them deal with extensive droughts, supporting local parishes so that the communities prepare their own natural resource management plans, so that they feel the ownership and they are also responsible for its management. And we have also installed automatic weather stations for giving the farmers better agrometeorological information to be ready before the flood arrives, before the drought arrives. But the really innovative aspect of this project is that we have applied the Gender Action Learning System, which we know in the UN we have a lot of acronyms. So the acronym is GALS, where we make sure that community facilitators and household mentors who work with farmer groups and vulnerable households identify what the issues are, the issues and the priorities. We need to understand better how many women, how many youth, what are they doing, do they own the land, do they have a bank account, so that we can really help design these projects and help women empowerment. So it's not just about targeting 50% of women in our projects, it's really making sure that we ensure transformation. And that's why we need this type of analysis at the beginning of the program. So in this way, we think we are promoting this inclusiveness, making sure that as we identify early who are the most vulnerable communities, then the project is really prioritizing these people and the solutions for them, making sure that we leave no one behind. We also, in this type of projects, we are ensuring that we not only think of yields. Sometimes we become very obsessed in increasing yields, but it's not just about calorie intake, increasing calorie intake. It's ensuring that this calorie intake is more nutritious. Maybe less calories are needed, but more nutritious food, to make sure that we don't have serious development challenges that we are facing in many countries because of stunting and because of the lack of nutritious food for the small kids and the babies in the first 100 days. The other project that is very innovative as well is in Niger, and is part of this program that Connie was describing on the integrated approach, which is, again, a very interesting project because this project has been implemented by many UN agencies. FAO is one of our partners in this program. And we have projects in 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa with 7 implementing institutions. So it's, as you will imagine, a bit challenging. But here we are concentrating on improving soil moisture and making sure that we are promoting the best practices to improve soil quality and land restoration. And sometimes when we talk about soil protection and land restoration, we think this is only an environmental issue. But in fact, this is what makes agricultural lands more productive. And that's why under the threats of climate, we need to ensure that we take into account all the environmental components of the areas where we are working. So here we not only work in this environmental component, but we are also supporting the training in financial literacy of smallholders to make sure that they also have access to finance, and the private sector is cooperating with the smallholder in really lending money for climate resilient practices. So we are just the broker in this case, ensuring the private sector is helping smallholders, but smallholders understand the issues of finance, and the private sector is ready to lend them money. So the issue for us really is that if we looked at what we have achieved with ASAP, with 42 projects in 41 countries, we see that we have promoted a lot of innovation. But we see the numbers of the beneficiaries we have reached and the scale, and we clearly see the need of finance, for more finance, and the need to scale up, because these good practices really shouldn't be just in 41 countries, in one remote area in these countries, but it should be in all Niger, Mali, Rwanda, in all the whole country. So our expectation is that we need to keep pace, all of us, to really meet Agenda 2030. But we have to remember that to achieve this, we need additional financial resources, and to make sure that the development outcomes guarantee equitable, efficient, and resilient rural transformation. This is our aim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me pass this over.
Okay.
Yeah, don't trust that one to work. So we'll move to FAO and ask a similar question. Alexander Jones is the director of FAO's Climate and Environment Division. He's worked on relief and development programs throughout the world for the last 20 years, and there's a long list of countries here that I'm not going to read because there's such a long list of countries, so a great deal of experience in the field. So along similar lines, can you tell us a bit more about what FAO is doing to support countries now that agriculture is becoming more important, or at least more recognized in the global climate agenda?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I could say that it's an exciting and exhausting time to be working in this field because, and I think Margarita would agree with me that, and other colleagues as well, we have to remember that at COP21 there wasn't a single word about agriculture on the declaration, and that was 2.5 years ago. I know at the time all of us talked about that, complained about it, and so forth. But that recently, it was not on the agenda. Everything is about, carbon pricing and energy and transport and cute electric cars. And I like electric cars. That's not a problem. But if we look at the numbers, as was said before, the second area of emission after energy is the agriculture sector. And by that, of course, we mean the full sector: agriculture, livestock, primarily livestock, forestry, and so on. It's not transport. So it's been a wild ride, and I'm glad that altogether everybody's managed to come to the point where we do have the Marrakesh Partnership. We have the Coronavia Joint Work on Agriculture, which, for those who are not aware, is an agreement reached at the last COP in Bonn to do a 2-year joint work to develop standards, principles, and objectives, which we hope will be something with teeth in it, which will commit us all to working on the agriculture sector. So it's exciting. Now, the exhausting part comes in the fact that somebody has certainly jumped out of the woodwork and said, help, help, we don't know anything about this. Can you help us? And that takes many different forms. And all of us that we coordinate, I was just in a meeting with some of you a couple days ago, are facing the same challenge. We have countries that signed up to very ambitious nationally determined contributions in Paris, which were perhaps a bit overly ambitious. Now, it's good that they were ambitious. At the same time, many had not really thought how they were going to achieve those NDCs. There was a lot of, political processes, which is normal, and there was a lot of ambition. At the same time, the NDCs that were signed in Paris will only take us 1/3 of the way to the 2-degree scenario that we all want. So we need to go even further. Now, simultaneously, all of those countries have signed up to SDGs. And we have a key problem, is that within countries, at the operational level, the SDGs are generally owned by development ministries, finance ministries, and so forth, while the NDCs are owned by climate ministry, environment ministry. And there's a certain lack of coherence, because many people say, okay, well, SDGs means intensification, whatever the cost. We need to eliminate hunger, SDG 1, SDG 2, and so forth. And the others are saying, well, no, NDCs, mitigation, reduce emissions. And of course, a lot of them are at loggerheads. So we currently have 89 formal requests for assistance from that many countries to help them in policy coherence work, access to green finance, facilitation, drafting NDCs, drafting national adaptation plans, and so forth. So exciting, exhausting. It's a good time to be there. In FAO, we had just created the climate division 2.5 years ago, so I would say well-timed, which is part of the larger climate, energy, soil, water, and biodiversity division. But of course, we, like everybody else, were a bit caught off guard by so much enthusiasm. So we're basically working in 3 areas. One is supporting this policy dialogue. We have about another 1.5 years before the Coronilla joint work on agriculture needs to produce something, and it has to be something very serious. So in our role as a convener and facilitator, we're bringing together the actors, especially the G77 actors that have less means to do so. We're facilitating workshops, which are generally closed-door workshops. We operate under Chatham House rules, so people can truly say what they want. And we try to work out all the many contradictions and problems within those workshops. We're also developing a broad range of tools, instruments, standards, guidelines. Some of you may have seen just before COP last year, we released a new version of the Climate Smart Agriculture Guidelines. We're producing adaptation indicators. So global goods. There's a very wide range of global goods being produced. At the country level, we're working essentially on 3 lines. One is supporting countries in their mitigation policies through the support of their NDCs, looking at those NDCs, in some cases helping them to formulate them, because a lot of them are, for the moment, still just very broad outlines and sketches. We're also working on their national adaptation plans. And of course, as you know, this is the primary demand from the Global South, is help with adaptation. There's always a little bit of tension in the issue of mitigation versus adaptation, but there is no question that everybody needs adaptation support. So some of it is adaptation planning, excuse me, some is purely technical assistance. And the third major area where we're working is on climate finance. And this is, for us, largely 2 pillars. It's the GEF, and as you probably know, we're moving into GEF 7. Next week is the GEF Assembly in Da Nang. FAO is the 4th largest partner of the GEF, and the GEF, with its impact programs, is moving more and more into climate-type work, even though it remains very strong in other areas. And then the GCF, which is, of course, the biggest fund out there, the most complex one. We're currently supporting 27 countries in preparing proposals. We have 1 approved. Yes! We have another one going to the board the week after next, and we have our fingers crossed. We have another 5 this year going in. These are huge, complex proposals. They're very difficult. They're very expensive. Anybody who's been involved with these, I'm sure, is bearing the scars of it. But it's a new fund, and we expect that. And then we have 25 more proposals lined up, a whole those one. One other very important area that I want to stress is that for us, adaptation also means resilience. We're looking both at long-term stress of countries, but also we're looking closely at shocks. And as you know, we have quite a large humanitarian program. It's about half of FAO's field program. So our work on sudden onset disasters, outbreaks, mitigation, and so on. Within my division, we have a full-time DRR team working as well. So to summarize, it's a very large scope of work. We're finding new demands and new requests all the time. We do have some very generous support from our resource partners, including Sweden. And I do want to stress that in addition to financial resources, we're very grateful for the political support. Because at a time when there are some countries casting doubt on the basic science, including my own, and questioning some of the basics, the political support is equally important, and we need to keep that very strongly.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Wede in a minute, but I forgot I was supposed to make an announcement. Before we were here starting, Johannes was looking at his phone, and of course you'd think he'd read his email or maybe looking up something on climate change. He was checking the score of the Sweden-South Korea game. So I get to report that Sweden won 1-0. It kept its lead. So Victoria has some flags there. She could pull them out and wave them. We'll move on to Wede, who's more of a rugby fan, I know, because we used to watch rugby together. So Wede Omamo is the Deputy Director for Policy and Program and Coordination and Food System Strategy at the World Food Program. He first joined WFP in 2006 and has served in a number of roles, including Chief of Social Protection and Livelihoods, Chief of Food Security and Safety Nets, and now in his current role. He was also here at EFAD at one point in charge of global engagement and the research division. So welcome, Wede. Again, on similar lines, how well are the RBAs collaborating on the humanitarian development nexus, right? We know a lot of the humanitarian issues are driven by climate change, so how well are we collaborating in that particular area?
Thank you very much, and I guess I should begin by saying sorry for being late, but actually I was early. According to the program that I had, we were supposed to start right now at 4:15, so I was actually relaxed and early, only to find that I'm actually late, but so sorry about that. It's really super to be back at IFAD with friends and colleagues. Before I address that question, Paul, if you wouldn't mind, I just introduce a little bit about WFP's work on climate, just for the group. The motivation for WFP's work, actually, before I say that, I'm actually representing another former IFAD colleague, Gernot Laganda, who is the one who's supposed to be sitting here, but he had an unexpected trip to Washington. So I don't look like him, but I'll try to say some of the things that he might have said. But the motivation for our work in climate is actually driven by the fact that so many people affected by climate disasters find themselves needing support from WFP. I don't have the exact number on me, but it's upwards of 40 million people a year who are affected by natural disasters of different kinds, especially now when that combines with conflict to really drive vulnerability and food insecurity. So this is the motivation overall, and the agenda, if you like, is to support the transition from crisis response to longer-term risk management featuring enhanced resilience, just as other colleagues have said. So the basis for this is our strategic plan, which has two hooks, SDG 2 and SDG 17, where climate issues cut right across. For those of you familiar with our strategic plan, there are 8 strategic results which are linked directly to SDG targets, and climate is fundamental to those. We also have a climate change policy, and this is really what guides the work, that has 3 elements to it: capacity development, policies and programs, and innovation and partnerships. So with regard to capacity development, the objective there is to increase WFP and partner capacities to design and implement high-quality climate risk management programs. So that's the objective there. Under policies and programs, here very much along the lines that Alex was saying, supporting governments, partners, and of course our own staff in climate policy engagement and program development, especially through national adaptation plans, NDCs, and climate finance processes. And under innovation and partnerships, there the agenda is to support development of climate analyses, interventions, and partnerships to ensure that the best risk management options can be implemented. So that's the policy framework. But more importantly, the operational expression of those focuses very much on risk reduction, as Alex was signaling, is the same for FAO, and risk transfer. So, and there are 2, you can think of 2 blocks of work. With regard to climate risk reduction, here there are a number of activities. First, on climate information services, so empowering vulnerable and food insecure communities to better access the information they need to manage risk and respond. And examples there would be Malawi and Tanzania. And then a very large body of work covering upwards of 25 million people in disaster risk reduction infrastructure and community assets. This is built on food assistance for assets in both in-kind and cash-based transfers to address some of those underlying natural drivers of vulnerability. Then, and here examples would be, of course, Ethiopia, Senegal, and other countries. And then there's some work in energy services. I'm sure you're familiar with the safe stoves. There, vulnerable populations, especially women, trying to help them, first of all, have better protection for themselves, but also to improve energy efficiency of the stoves that they're cooking fuel. And here, Kenya and Senegal would be good examples. And then increasingly important body of work on forecast-based finance. And here, Malawi and Zambia would be examples. In terms of climate risk transfer, there are three areas: integrated risk financing, and here the partnership with a number of agencies in the R4, the Rural Resilience Initiative is an example, Ethiopia and Senegal there. Risk pooling and sovereign insurance, the partnership with the African Union to develop the Africa Risk Capacity platform, and then contingency funds and savings, so Malawi, Zambia. So those are some of the examples of the work that we're doing. Now, in terms of RBA collaboration, it varies. It varies based on a number of things. First, on the capacity at the country level of the different agencies, the demand being expressed by government, and then the reality of actual program implementation. And so there's some very good examples in a number of countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, a really good example in Kenya where all three agencies have come together to try and do this bridging of crisis response to resilience building to actual transformation of communities. So WFP's beneficiaries who are receiving particular food assistance for assets then become recipients potentially of support from IFAD on the finance side and also from FAO on the production potential of their farms. So there is, I think, enormous potential for us to partner, and it's being seized in different ways. Where in Ethiopia, there is a huge demand in the Somali area. Some of you may have familiar with this, where a combination of conflict, climate stress, and governance issues are requiring and are creating openings for WFP, IFAD, and FAO to combine efforts to try and address the challenges facing pastoral communities in these areas. It's early days, but hopefully we'll be able to seize that opportunity. Now, I think, as I said up front, that the real challenge is to be able to do this in space and time using capacities that are available. Oftentimes, one agency is present in a much larger way than others, and so aligning those capacities is a big challenge. But I think it's clearly a surmountable one. If there's a will, we can do it. Let me stop there, and hopefully there'll be chances to talk.
Thank you. So we'll turn it over to all of you to see if there's any questions coming from the group. Yes, please.
Hello. I'm from APR, IFAD. I have a couple of questions, but thank you very much for the presentations or the introduction. So one of the things I find challenging oftentimes is from the donor agency's perspective, as one of the speakers was saying, like you have priorities on SDGs, and then on COP23, which one you're going to promote. Oftentimes happens that you're focusing on with one project on climate change, another one on fossil fuel subsidies, and something else. How you can ensure that things don't fall in between your fingers like that? That's one. Oftentimes the projects have, nowadays the projects are becoming more shorter terms, 5-7 years maybe. I will give you one example that I faced. Solar panels installed in remote communities, but they got electricity right away, the solar panels goes away. How we ensure that we can monitor those, or we keep them in the system? And the last speaker was talking about the challenge. I want to hear from others. What do you think of the challenge of WFP, FAO, and IFAD collaborating? What's the biggest challenge you think out there? And last but not the least, you talked about a project going on for, there is 1.5 years still. How youths are engaged in that whole process? Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a long list of questions, so we'll have to see what we can answer. When I was a professor and students asked me more than one question, I just picked the one that I liked, so we'll see what the panel does.
Thank you very much, Paul. Last week I was in Bern for a Jeff constituency workshop for Central Asia, and we had somebody from the Independent Office of Evaluation of the GCF to come and do a very short keynote speech. And I was expecting a very technical discussion about monitoring, evaluation, analysis, lesson learning of GCF project. But she started by, she made it very short, and she started by asking, what do we sort of northern Westerners, rich people, can do about climate change? What's the one action we can do to change our lives to reduce our carbon footprint? And I'm sure you know what it is, right? But do you, Michael? To stop eating meat, yeah, to become vegetarian. So now this is a message that would be addressed probably to our wealthier constituents who are on our governing bodies of WFP, IFAD, and FAO, maybe more than to our beneficiaries where we are supporting, for instance, pastoralist lifestyles and so on that are valued and valuable in certain circumstances. But the fact is that pastoralist lifestyles that most of us know better than how our own meat is grown really represent a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of meat products consumed nowadays. So seeing our outreach, seeing our mandate, I'm just wondering why we've never seen any such thing as a public statement of opinion or public information campaigns or statements from the three Rome-based agencies beyond technical studies of FAO that sort of establish some scientific basis but don't really draw the conclusions. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Just one last question, and then I'll hand them out to the panel.
Thank you. Mine is just to ask, from your experiences, what are the incentives for the private sector to be involved in, addressing climate challenges? So far, the resources seem to be very much public sector driven, but there is opportunities for private sector. What are the incentives from your experience?
Okay, thanks. So why don't we, I'll try to divvy up the questions. So if you don't mind, Johannes, the first question that was on the donor priorities, and seemingly that sometimes there's not always seeming consistency, and how do you try to resolve that?
First, I want to say I'm a vegetarian. I cheat when I travel. I travel too much. I travel by plane, so, all the bad things, but at least I try a little bit at home. I think you touch on a very, very important question. We developed, or the then Swedish government, and it was adopted by the Swedish Parliament, what we call the policy coherence on development, now 15 years ago, where we said that we would look at domestic politics in terms of its development impact not on climate specifically, but in all different areas. I think that has been a successful policy. It has led to a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. It has led to some changes in policy and the way we go about issues. But clearly, there are issues where it's very, very difficult to make to make the difficult choices that it would call for. So I'm hoping that at least it contributes to a debate, but I'm not saying that we have sort of delivered a perfect system. Weapons exports is one example that keeps coming back, and it's true that we're involved. On climate, we are lucky in that our Minister for Development Cooperation is also our Minister for Climate. So that's one way of addressing it. She heads the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in its development section, but she also heads the Ministry of Environment in terms of climate mitigation. And you know, this is not necessarily true for all coming governments, but it's a choice that they've made currently, and it's a way of trying to address that issue. And I think, you know, there will still be challenges, but that's one way of trying at least to address it and handling those issues, and remembering, of course, also that this is the perfect storm of domestic politics and foreign policy and everything at once. So it's clearly challenging, but I think much more can be done, and I think it's an important issue to identify.
Okay, thanks. If you can, Margarita, I was thinking if you could answer the question on the private sector and the role of the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the most important element for the private sector is to not lose their business. I think that is what we have seen, for example, when we listen to the CEO of Unilever or the CEO of Olam, or the companies that have now a big program on climate adaptation. When we talk about with them, the issue for them is really ensure that they will have the grains they need to produce the food they export or the fish, so for them it's just, it makes sense. They don't want to not being able to reach the markets. So, of course, it depends on what kind of private sector we are talking about. Because, as you know, here in IFAD we see the small farmer organizations also as part of the private sector. So for them, the case is more evident than for the bigger ones, because for them their livelihoods depend on being able to have a crop of corn or cassava at the end of the season. So I think climate is now so evident that at all levels everybody's concerned. But if I may, I would like to link it also with the comment made by Nicolas, because last week in Stockholm there was one of the largest companies, livestock companies, that exports and buys meat from different places in the world. And there was this big group on proteins from other sources. So this big company, which is based in Spain, was really worried about the big push for moving into alternative proteins. So I was talking to them and saying, so what are you planning on doing? Because your business will die if, based on the climate issues and environmental issues, livestock goes down. I said, we are already working on developing other plant proteins and planting and getting markets for alternative plant proteins. So the private sector has also that advantage that they are not sleeping waiting for the hammer to come down. They are already looking into the future, knowing that in a few years' time probably the international community don't want to see more livestock or as much as we have right now.
Okay, following up on that, I was going to let Alexander also talk about that livestock issue.
Okay. Is that working? Okay, got it now. Big issue. Just one thing to add to what Margarita was saying. I mean, the private sector is central to everything. The estimate under Paris Agreement is that we need $100 billion per year over the next 10 years to achieve the climate goals that have been set out. Now, just to put that in context, the entire ODA flow globally is only $160 billion. Okay, so there's no way that's going to come out of ODA when, as was rightly pointed out, there are so many other challenges, life-saving, immediate challenges. We know that 90 to 95% of that has to come from the private sector. That's just the way it is. And the funds that are available to all of us need to be leveraged to de-risk capital to make it possible. So market-based solutions are the only way it's going to happen, no matter what we want to do. There is no way that the world can come up with $100 billion a year in public capital. The issue of livestock obviously is very complex, and I would, be a little bit cautious, much as Nikolai is an old friend, because, after my ancestors have been guzzling their way into gout for 2,000 years eating meat, to suddenly stand up and tell the global south, like, halt, you shall not eat meat. You're going to go on vegetable-based proteins. That's a little bit harsh, I would say. And it's exactly the same reaction we get when we say, you're not going to emit any more carbon, like after we've, of course, polluted our way to prosperity for 2 centuries. So it's a local choice. I would say let's let market forces, let's let knowledge forces work the way they can, but obviously we're not here to tell people they do not have access to energy-dense foods. One other important thing to remember, at present we have the technology to reduce emissions from all animal sources by 30% right now. So if we estimate that animal GHG emissions, animal-related, I'm talking about the whole sector, about 11% of the total, we can reduce that today by 30% through better manure management, feed management, and genetics if resources are available. So it's not impossible, and we have to look at a transition in that sector.
So, Wede, there was a question about kind of the length of projects and the time of projects. How does WFP work to ensure kind of the sustainability of what they're doing, especially when you have these crises you have to deal with, and then you are able to see how it can last what you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. It's a big challenge because of the way funding is accessed. So oftentimes the work that is most easy to support is that short-term work. And the longer term work is less easy. But nevertheless, we at WFP we have we're at the moment of transition where hopefully we'll be able to work with partners to address that a bit better. We have a new framework for our engagement at the country level called Country Strategic Plans, which is different from the old approach, which was built around projects, emergency projects, recovery projects, development projects. Now, country strategic plans that are based on national priorities that then cascade to our priorities in line with the SDGs, those SDGs 2 and 17. So this is opening up the opportunity to have the right kinds of discussions with governments and other partners. And second, to have the right kinds of discussions with donors around initiatives that are built around strategic outcomes that are not necessarily short-term, in fact. But nevertheless, it's proving to be a challenge. But we think over time this will help address the issue. Now, so that's sort of at the strategic level. Okay, on the ground, I think really we think that there are two ways in which it's possible to make progress, and that is through integration of activities in two ways. First, through previously distinct programmatic areas. So, for instance, a food assistance for assets intervention alongside a school feeding intervention. That gives the opportunity to address issues over the longer term, so programmatic areas. But second, and this for WFP anyway, is a really big opportunity, and that is integrating program work with supply chain work. It's huge. And an example there would be, I guess the best example is the Purchase for Progress initiative, where we have a demand for food. Where should we express that demand? Well, we can express it to smallholders, but they then need support on the program side to respond. So this gives the opportunity to combine the demand for short-term response with the opportunity to engage over the longer term. Now, it's really important. It links to the RBA question that you mentioned earlier. There's no way that WFP or anybody could do that kind of integration by itself. You really have to work in partnership. So the way that this is expressing itself in our portfolio is through our food systems work, which has three broad objectives. First, on resilient food systems, where that's combining climate work with supply chain and typically oftentimes a safety net type of intervention. Efficient and inclusive food systems, and their smallholder type of work with supply chain activities. And the third area is safe and nutritious food systems. So again, but there's no way that this can be delivered by one agency. And so we're increasingly looking for opportunities at the country level, because that's where things really need to happen, at the country level, to pursue these sort of systemic opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. So we're out of time, so we'll need to stop here. I'm going to give some final remarks to our guest who's visiting here from Sweden, so maybe some key points or takeaways that you've gotten from this.
Thank you very much. Well, First, I was a little taken aback by agriculture not being mentioned in COP21. I realized I should have read up better and known that from, but it was a little shocking to me, I have to admit. I'll choose to sort of try and see that in a positive light. I think you're all witnessing of a lot of different activities and a lot of different. A lot of different good examples of projects and programs that are coming along and are moving along, and seeing that I know the issue is older than COP21, but still seeing that it's been sort of really on top of the agenda only for such a short period, I think that what we have talked about here today is witness to that we are on the path, we are moving in the right direction, but there should always also be, allow us to admit that we are at the beginning of that path, and of course, what we need to do is to continue that, continue those efforts, and there are good examples that we need to scale up, allowing also our organizations to have the capacity to do that scaling up. Of course, financing is very central, very key. I fully agree that we need the private sector to become more involved and really to be, also in terms of technological and innovative thinking, innovative ways of handling this, really be the solution. At the same time, of course, I think as a donor, I also think that there's a big responsibility on donors, and there is room left for the donors to also live up to their commitments, and which will also, of course, be a way of providing the space to which is needed to also engage the private sector and move along with the good examples we have. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And just thanks to our guests from coming from WFP and FAO, and sorry for the confusion over the schedule, and the Swedish delegation for coming, and for those that have organized this, thank you very much. So we are very happy that we're able to have this event, and we hope that we'll have a chance to do this again sometime. So thank you.